All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty fundamental, the difference between civil law and criminal law.
Yeah, it's one of those things that might seem basic, but actually gets really interesting when you start looking closer.
Exactly. And we've got some great material to work with today straight from the classroom.
Real nuts and bolts stuff.
So our mission, if you choose to accept it, is to come away from this deep dive with a rock-solid understanding of these two branches of the legal system. And maybe, just maybe, along the way, we'll spark some new thoughts about justice and how it all works.
Sounds like a plan.
So let's jump right in. What's the core idea behind civil law? What do we absolutely need to grasp?
Well, at its heart, civil law is all about disputes.
Disputes. Okay,
Yeah.
so we're talking about disagreements, conflicts, but between who?
Right. Between individuals, organizations, any two parties who find themselves at odds.
So not necessarily the state or government coming after someone?
Not in civil law. Here, it's more about one party claiming they've been harmed in some way by the actions of another.
Okay, so that harm could be.
Oh, it could be a lot of things. Breach of contract, negligence, property damage, even something like defamation of character.
And the goal in a civil case is
To make the injured party whole again.
to make them whole. You mean like restore what they've lost?
Exactly. And that's often done through financial compensation. It's not really about punishing the person who caused the harm.
Got it. So we have the plaintiff, the person bringing the case, and the defendant, the one accused of causing the harm. And the aim is to make things right for the plaintiff, usually through some sort of payment.
That's the gist of it, yeah.
The supermarket slip and fall example from our classroom material really drives this home. Do you want to walk us through that?
Sure. So imagine someone's walking through the supermarket and they slip on a wet floor. No warning signs, nothing. They end up with a broken leg or something.
Ouch. Sounds like a lawsuit waiting to happen.
It very well could be. That person could sue the supermarket for negligence, claiming they failed to provide a safe environment for shoppers.
And they'd be asking for compensation to cover their medical bills, maybe lost wages if they couldn't work.
Exactly. And the court would have to decide whether the supermarket was indeed at fault, and if so, how much they should pay to compensate the injured party.
Classic civil law in action. Individual versus individual, with the focus on righting a wrong through compensation.
Precisely.
Okay, so now let's switch gears to criminal law. How does that differ in its overall purpose?
Well, with criminal law, the focus shifts from individual disputes to offenses against society as a whole.
Offenses against society, you mean like?
Crimes, essentially. Things that are considered harmful to the community at large, like theft, assault, murder.
So in a criminal case, it's not one person versus another. It's the state, the government, coming after someone for breaking the law.
Right. The government acts as the prosecution, representing society's interest in upholding the law. And they bring the case against the defendant, the person accused of committing the crime.
And the goal in a criminal case?
Well, it's twofold. First, to punish the offender for their actions. And second, to deter future crime, both by the individual and by others.
Makes sense. Punish and deter. So we're talking jail time, fines, things like that.
Exactly. The penalties in criminal law are designed to be more punitive, more about holding people accountable for actions that harm the social fabric.
The bank robbery scenario from our source material is a good illustration of this.
It is. It's not just about the bank losing money. A bank robbery shakes people's sense of security. It disrupts the whole community.
It undermines that feeling of safety we all rely on. So the penalties are there to make a statement, to show that these actions won't be tolerated.
Right. It's about protecting the community and maintaining order.
This highlights a big difference then between civil and criminal law. It's about the intended outcome. In civil law, it's compensation. In criminal law, it's punishment and deterrence.
Absolutely. And that difference is also reflected in who the parties are, how the cases are initiated, and even the terminology used.
Speaking of differences, what about the burden of proof? That's a concept that always seems to come up in legal discussions.
Yeah, it's crucial. And it's one of the clearest distinctions between civil and criminal cases.
So in a civil case, how much proof does the plaintiff need to present to win their case?
They need to prove their case by a preponderance of the evidence.
Preponderance of the evidence, meaning
Meaning, more likely than not, their version of events is true. It's like a tipping of the scales. If the evidence leans even slightly in their favor, they can win.
okay, so it's not about proving something definitively with absolute certainty. It's more about probability.
Right. 51% certainty, essentially.
And how does that compare to the burden of proof in a criminal case?
Oh, it's a much higher bar. In a criminal case, the prosecution has to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
Beyond a reasonable doubt. So basically, they need to be as close to certain as humanly possible.
Exactly. There can't be any lingering questions, any other plausible explanation. The evidence has to be overwhelming.
Wow, that's a huge difference. So civil law is about probability, while criminal law demands near certainty. And that makes sense, right? When you're talking about potentially depriving someone of their liberty, you want to be absolutely sure.
Precisely. The stakes are just much higher in a criminal case.
And this difference in the burden of proof explains why you sometimes see different outcomes in cases that stem from the same event.
Right, like the O.J. Simpson case.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. Can you remind our listeners how that case played out?
Sure. So Simpson was famously tried for murder. That was the criminal case. But the jury found him not guilty.
Meaning the prosecution couldn't meet that incredibly high burden of proof. They couldn't convince the jury beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right. But then the families of the victims filed a civil lawsuit against Simpson for wrongful death.
So same tragic event, but now it's a civil case. What happened there?
Well, in the civil case, the burden of proof was lower. They only had to prove his responsibility by a preponderance of the evidence.
And they succeeded.
They did. The jury in the civil case found Simpson liable for the deaths, and he was ordered to pay millions in damages.
It's fascinating how the same set of facts can lead to such different outcomes depending on which legal system is involved.
It really underscores how these two branches of law operate with different aims and different standards.
Absolutely. So just to recap, we've got civil law dealing with disputes between individuals or organizations and aiming for compensation. And then we've got criminal law focused on offenses against society as a whole with the goal of punishment and deterrence.
And that difference in focus explains all the other differences. The parties involved, the burden of proof, the types of penalties.
It all fits together. Now, here's something for our listeners to ponder. We've talked about how the burden of proof is much higher in criminal cases. And that's understandable, right? We want to make sure we're not wrongly imprisoning innocent people.
Right. We place a very high value on individual liberty.
But does that higher standard in criminal cases, that need for near certainty, create a kind of imbalance in the legal system? Does it make it harder to hold people accountable for actions that harm others, even if those actions don't rise to the level of a crime?
That's a really interesting question. It makes you think about the trade-offs involved, about what we prioritize as a society. Do we sometimes err on the side of letting guilty people go free to protect the innocent? Or should we be more willing to accept some risk of error in order to ensure accountability?
Definitely something to chew on. And it highlights how these legal concepts aren't just abstract ideas. They have real-world consequences that affect all of us.
Absolutely.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive for today. Hopefully you've come away with a clearer understanding of the differences between civil and criminal law, and maybe even some new questions to think about.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great discussion.
Always a pleasure. And thanks to our listeners for joining us on the deep dive.
Until next time.